Dwight Howard just put something in writing that changes the entire tone of this divorce. In new court documents obtained by TMZ, he's alleging that his estranged wife, Amy Luciani, knew she was unable to have biological children and hid that from him before they got married. His position is blunt. Had he known the truth about her fertility, he says he never would have married her at all. That's not a comment thrown out in an interview. That's a formal allegation attached to a request for a protective order, which means his legal team is treating it as something they're prepared to argue in front of a judge, not just something to float in the press. Luciani's response has been just as direct. She denies it outright. No hedging, no partial admission, a flat denial, according to TMZ's reporting, which leaves exactly the kind of standoff family courts deal with constantly. One person claiming deliberate deception, the other calling it false, and no independent way for the public to know which version is accurate. There's no third-party confirmation floating around yet. No medical records referenced publicly, no witnesses named, nothing beyond the filing itself and her denial of it. That gap is worth sitting with, because it's exactly the kind of allegation that tends to generate more headlines than hard evidence. What makes this filing land differently than a typical "he lied, she lied" divorce complaint is what Howard is attaching to it. He's not framing the fertility claim as a standalone lie. He's using it as the anchor for a much bigger argument, that Luciani has a documented pattern of lying and manipulating him throughout their entire relationship. Instead of asking a judge to weigh one disputed claim, he's asking the court to see the fertility allegation as proof of a broader character issue, which theoretically makes every other accusation he's made against her land harder. Legal filings built this way are rarely about a single incident. They're about establishing a pattern convincing enough that a judge starts reading every subsequent claim through that lens. And there's a lot sitting underneath this that isn't new. Howard also accuses Luciani of running what his filing calls a crusade of lies and defamation against him, claiming her public statements cost him professional opportunities and damaged relationships with his family, friends, and the mothers of his other children. That's a real financial claim buried inside an emotional one.
My business phones, I'm on his phone plan, so both phones I have on me are on his. My insurance.
If he can show actual lost income tied to specific statements she made, a canceled endorsement, a rescinded appearance, a broadcast gig that fell through, that's the part of this filing that could carry legal weight independent of whatever happened or didn't happen. Fertility courts are generally more comfortable adjudicating provable financial harm than they are litigating what someone privately knew about their own body years before a wedding. Go back a few months and you'll see why none of this reads as isolated. Luciani previously posted an emotional, now deleted video alleging Howard has a cocaine problem, at one point showing a bag with white powder while claiming it was tied to his behavior. In that same period, she said CPS had come to their home.
I try to tell everybody he needs some help, and ain't nobody would have fucking listened because he got the money.
3 times in under 3 months, and that her daughter had been removed. Around that same stretch, Howard's side accused Luciani of manipulating his son into contacting CPS on her. 2 separate CPS entanglements overlapping in time, each side blaming the other for causing it. That's the backdrop this new filing is dropping into, and it's why "she tricked me into marriage" reads less like a fresh accusation and more like the next chapter of something that's been building for months. Howard filed for divorce in March 2026, a little over a year after the two married in January 2025. That's a marriage that lasted barely 14 months before it was heading to court, and the split since then has involved multiple police visits to the home, competing filings from both sides, restraining order requests, and a steady stream of public accusations that have played out almost entirely in view of the public rather than behind closed doors. That timeline matters because it shows this wasn't a slow deterioration that eventually became public. It went public almost immediately and has stayed that way through every subsequent development. Royce Reed hasn't stayed out of it either, and given her with Howard, that's not surprising. Reed, who shares a teenage son with Howard, has been openly unsympathetic toward Luciani throughout this entire saga, essentially arguing that she warned people about Howard's behavior years ago and got dismissed as bitter or jealous for it. When the CPS story broke, Reed's reaction wasn't sympathy. It was closer to vindication, framing the situation as proof she'd been right all along. She pointed directly at the fact that Luciani had reportedly been present for the same environment she was now fleeing, arguing that suddenly speaking up after the fact, once I personally affected her, wasn't the same as protecting the children all along. She also pushed back hard against critics who accused her of gloating, insisting her focus was on the kids rather than settling a score. Reed has continued weighing in publicly as new developments surface, which means every fresh filing from Howard's side gets read by at least one very engaged, very unfiltered third party who has her own long-running conflict with him. Braylon, Howard's son with Reed, also spoke out during the earlier CPS controversy, and his tone stood in sharp contrast to everyone else in this story.
And this is it. This is what I'm...
Rather than piling on with outrage, he took a measured approach, acknowledging that the situation was difficult across his extended family, while essentially telling his father to get help and pointing out that he and his mother had voiced these concerns long before any of this became public. That reaction got attention specifically because it was the calmest voice in a situation where practically everyone else, Howard, Luciani, Reed, was talking in headlines and accusations. When a teenager sounds like the most composed person in a legal and family mess involving multiple adults, that's worth noting on its own. Here's the part that makes this filing harder to square with where things stood earlier this year. Back in April, Howard was granted a protective order against Luciani and then dropped it within days. His attorney told People at the time that dismissing the restraining order in exchange for progress in the divorce case was meant to be a step toward an amicable resolution. That's a man who, at least on paper, was trying to cool things down and move towards settling this quietly. Going from let's find an amicable resolution to filing detailed allegations about being deceived into marriage and defamed publicly is a significant shift in a short window. Something clearly didn't hold. Whether that's new information reaching Howard's team, continued public statements from Luciani that reignited the conflict, or the amicable framing being more about optics than substance from the start. Whatever changed, it was enough to push him back into requesting another protective order, rather than continuing down the cooperative path his attorney described just months earlier. Online reaction has split in a way that doesn't map neatly onto Team Dwight versus Team Amy. A good portion of the conversation is skeptical of the fertility allegations specifically, not because people doubt something happened, but because proving someone concealed knowledge of their own fertility status years before a relationship began is an extremely difficult thing to substantiate in court. It's the kind of claim that generates a dramatic headline instantly, but requires documentation, medical records, prior communications, something concrete to hold up under scrutiny by a judge as inflammatory rather than persuasive, which could undercut the credibility argument Howard is trying to build rather than support it. Other corners of the conversation have focused less on who's telling the truth and more on the optics of litigating something this personal in public filings at all, given how quickly court documents in cases involving public figures tend to leak straight into entertainment coverage. Media outlets covering this have leaned into the fact that it keeps resurfacing instead of resolving. Most celebrity divorces follow a familiar arc. Public blow-up, followed by a period of relative silence while lawyers negotiate in the background, followed eventually by a quiet settlement announcement. This one hasn't done that. Every few weeks there's a new filing, a new public statement, a new person weighing in, and none of it seems to be moving toward closure. One notable detail from outlets tracking the story: while the fertility allegation was making headlines, Luciani herself stayed quiet on the specifics, choosing instead to mark her birthday publicly rather than respond point by point. That silence has been read two different ways, either as a deliberate choice to let her attorneys handle it rather than fuel another public back and forth, or as a sign she's simply worn down by how long this has dragged on. Either way, it's kept outlets treating this less like a single scandal and more like a story with recurring installments, each one adding another disputed detail rather than resolving the last one. There's also a custody dimension running underneath all of this that's getting less attention than the fertility claim, but could end up mattering more in the long run. With CPS already involved on both sides, her daughter reportedly removed, his son allegedly pushed to make a report, any court findings related to drug use, manipulation involving a minor, or false statements to authorities are the kind of thing that shapes custody arrangements, and those tend to be far stickier than divorce settlements. Money and property get divided and the case closes. Custody findings follow people, sometimes for years, and they're revisited far more easily than a finalized divorce decree. So where does this actually go? If Howard's team can produce something concrete, medical documentation, prior messages, statements from people close to the relationship, showing Luciani knew about her fertility status and actively concealed it, his position gets considerably stronger, and it becomes much harder for a judge to dismiss it as an emotional add-on to the filing. Without that kind of paper trail, though, the allegation is vulnerable to being characterized as an emotional argument rather than a legal one, especially given how hard proving concealed personal medical knowledge tends to be in any jurisdiction. On the other side, if Luciani can produce her own documentation contradicting his version, records showing she disclosed her situation, or communications proving Howard knew earlier than he's now claiming, this could just as easily flip into a defamation claim against him, particularly given how specific and public his allegations have become. Protective order filing built around a claim that later can't be substantiated is exactly the kind of thing that opens a door for a countersuit. There's also the question of how this affects both of their public standing, independent of what a judge eventually decides. Howard has already alleged reputational and financial harm from Luciani's earlier claims about his drug use. If his own allegations about her fertility turn out to be similarly unprovable, he risks facing the same kind of criticism he's leveling at her, that serious, hard-to-verify claims are being used as public leverage in a legal fight rather than genuine grievances pursued through proper channels. That's the kind of dynamic that tends to erode sympathy for both sides simultaneously, rather than building it for